Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious,
that we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family,
regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
My father could use a little mercy now. The fruits of his labor falling right slowly on the ground. His work is almost over. It won't be long, and he won't be around. I love my father. He could use some mercy now. My brother could use a little mercy now. He's a stranger to freedom, shackled by his fear and his doubt. And the pain that he lives in, it's almost more than living will allow. Well, I love my brother. He could use some mercy now. My church and my country could use a little mercy now. As we sink into a poison pit, it's gonna take forever to climb out. And we carry the weight of the faithful who follow us down. But I love my church and country. We could use some mercy now. Every living thing could use a little mercy now. Only the hand of grace can end the race towards another mushroom cloud. And some people in power, they'll do anything to hang on to their crown. Well, I love life and life itself could use some mercy now. Yeah, we all could use a little mercy now. We don't feel like we deserve it, but we need it anyhow. We hang in the balance, we're dangling between hell and hallowed ground. And every single one of us could use some mercy now. Yeah, every single one of us could use some mercy now. Yeah, every single one of us could use some mercy now.
Christ be with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ below me, Christ above me, Christ be with me. At my right hand, at my left hand, as I lie down, as I rise up, as I stumble, as I fall down, Christ, as I stand, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Amen. Amen.
My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. And may God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. my sister, God love you, God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you, and God bless you. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. Bring me a higher love. Bring me a higher love. Oh, oh. Bring me a higher love. Yes, it's that higher love I've been thinking of. Bring me a higher love. Bring me a higher love. Oh, oh. Bring me a higher love. It's that higher love I've been thinking of. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text CrosspointNC to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
You may have figured out that it doesn't matter what you've got going on in your life. If your relationships with other people aren't going very well, it affects everything. You could say that everything's going fine at work. You might even be doing well with money and your health. You got the new car, whatever. But you've got a romantic relationship that's on the rocks, or things are bad with parents or your kids or friends or whatever. Well, many of us in those circumstances would say, yeah, life still isn't very good. And for the last several years, this is what a lot of us have been experiencing, that no matter what else has been going on, many of us, we have relationships that have become very turbulent, so turbulent at times that those relationships have ended. Names can't be said anymore. Pictures have to be taken down. Events have been avoided. How things have been going between us has been the chief measure of how things have been going for us. So I'd like to talk a little bit, not exhaustively, about how we might be able to improve how it's going between us, while at the same time being completely honest and realistic as real life demands that we be. There's a quote that has meant a lot to me over the years, and I think about it all the time. It's Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he says, "When I was young, I used to admire intelligent people. As I grow older, I admire kind people. When I was younger, I used to admire people their thoughts were right, or they just were right about everything. They're dominant thinkers, they're winners, those kind of people. I looked up to those kind of people when I was young, but as I grow older, it's kind people that I admire." So to begin, I want to talk about somebody we've talked about several times in the last few weeks, King David. David is the king of Israel, and he's, people love him. They follow him, and as we've discussed recently, there's so many positive things that you can say about King David, but despite all those positive things, he's also pretty rough around the edges, which is probably an overly generous way of glazing over his abuse and his murder and his violence and his sexual assault and his general misuse of power in a lot of scenes. So among other things, he's a musician, and a lot of his songs are captured right there in the middle of our Bibles in what we call the Psalms, where he presents his faith and his role as a king and his sins and other people's sins, and singing about other nations and his hopes and his regrets. And I want to focus this morning a little bit on Psalm 32. He writes, "Happy are those whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Happy are those to whom the Lord imputes or attributes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. While I kept silence, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. I tried to keep the stuff inside, tried to hide it, and it was killing me. Day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Selah." That Selah term, scholars aren't entirely sure what this word means, but are in general agreement it's a musical term, which means rest or pause, reflect. Then he says, "Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not hide my iniquity. I said, I'll confess my transgressions to the Lord. I'm not going to hide this anymore. And you forgave the guilt of my sin, Selah. Therefore, let all who are faithful offer prayer to you at a time of distress. The rush of mighty waters shall not reach them." And you have to remember, he's singing this in Hebrew. It rhymes, there's a melody, there's all kinds of illustrations. And watch how he uses this illustration to give you a sense of what's going on in his heart. He says to God, sings to God, "You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with glad cries of deliverance, of freedom." So it's almost like in some places, he's painting this picture of like dealing with an accountant. And he says, blessed or fortunate is the one who goes to this accountant and finds out that the debt has been sharpied. The accountant just took a Sharpie to the books and covered over them and said, "We're good. You don't owe anything." But also notice that David starts by saying, "Happy are those whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." And then he sings, "I acknowledged my sin to you and did not hide my iniquity." And then he sings, "You are a hiding place for me." Blessed are those who experience covering, uncovering, covering. And see, I don't think David is saying God is how I get out of trouble. I think what David is talking about is the real work of grace. Because David has some serious things to wake up to. If you continue in this psalm or read some of his other work or just study the life of David, he's got some waking up to do. But here he's thanking God and saying, happy is the one who comes to discover that disclosing what is actually true to God will not be met with revulsion or disgust or self-righteous rage. No, for David, he discovers in that deliverance, freedom. You hide me, I unhide what I have been hiding. I am set free. So then generations later, there's this guy named John who wrote what we call the Gospel of John. It's a piece of literature that depicts Jesus in a very particular way because the author hopes that you'll be convinced to follow Jesus when you're done reading it. And he opens up in the first chapter of this gospel with this phrase about Jesus. He says, "The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." Calls Jesus the Word. This is an ancient Greek idea that John appeals to describe Jesus. This is logos in Greek. It's the concept of like this creative force, the cleverness and wisdom with which God creates everything that exists, this ultimate sustaining force. And John says that logos incarnated, became enfleshed and lived in our midst. Like literally, he says it tented with us, it set up camp with us. God with us is what John is talking about. And so if you're very familiar with this passage, you might take for granted how initially problematic it was to claim that the eternal, holy, almighty God would inhabit a human form. I mean, in some religions, it's still blasphemy to claim that God became a person. So this is a huge claim John starts off with. It's, I think, intended to rattle and disorient just for a second because it's intended to really wake us up, enlighten, and encourage us. That the eternal, intangible, incomprehensible one became a laughing, eating, crying, sleeping, peeing, pooping, shaving, dancing, singing human. And before we think that what that does is drags down the image of God by saying Jesus was divine, I'd like to think about what it says about our humanity. that it actually serves as quite an affirmation of the human condition, that maybe being a human isn't fundamentally bad if all history hinges on God entering that humanity, embodying it and loving it so. So John presents Jesus. The Logos comes to live in our midst and comes full of grace and truth. Well, that leads us to a question. What happens if one is not full of grace and truth, but is only full of one or the other, grace or truth? Because I think we all recognize people who are only one or the other, and we recognize they're not super tuned into reality if it's only one. You know, like the all grace people come off sort of flaky, don't they? Because they seem unwilling to call out bad behavior. They allow themselves to be walked on. They enable others. They've got this mantra that's like, everybody deserves a millionth chance to stop doing me harm. And the rest of us observe that. We're like, well, that's not grace. You're aiding and abetting a criminal. You're empowering an abuser. It looks to us like spinelessness that would rather have pseudo-peace than, you know, the real stuff. Or if it's not spinelessness, maybe it's a fear that if we're truthful about what is happening, well, that could cost me access or privilege, and I'm not willing to risk that by naming what's true. All grace all the time for a lot of reasons, just it's weak. But see, then there's also all truth all the time, which means first and foremost, you gotta be right, and if you're not right, well, I will right you. I assume many of you immediately have somebody that pops into your mind as I describe this person. And please, if you're sitting next to them, don't elbow them on the couch right now. That's the Holy Spirit's job. Halloween is a few weeks back at this point, and I cringed this Halloween as I do every Halloween, because my first year as a pastor, that Halloween, I took it upon myself to write our church a letter about Halloween, because I was an all truth all the time guy. I was obsessed with rightness. So I wrote this letter to our church in our newsletter we put out monthly, that real Christians couldn't celebrate trick or treat or Halloween. And then, of course, detailed why, all the background, history, and all the evils that regular people don't know, but truth people know. And when I was done writing it, before we published it, I gave it to a coworker, another pastor whose opinion mattered a lot to me. And I said, hey, what do you think of this? And he said, well, it's well written, but man, you're rigid, which surprised me because I thought I was right, not rigid. And he said, look, my family goes trick-or-treating because we like to be together and we like free candy, but we're not going to bow down to anything along the way. And that was jarring for me, because I was so infatuated with the power that comes with the idea of all truth all the time. I thought it was unmistakable that I had written something absolute, because I loved absolute, unshakable, unwavering truth in the face of so much worldly wrongness, you know. Because when I was young, I used to admire intelligent, right people. But as I grow older, I've come to admire kind people. Maybe you hear that and you're like, wait a minute, we're talking about the truth. People need the truth now more than ever, and I don't disagree. You know, the people that don't have the truth, they're off the path. They need to either be brought back on or barred from the path altogether. I understand what you're saying, and hang with me, because a lot of us were taught this early on in life, but we were taught by authority figures or parents that were either grace or truth. And this is part of the problem. If you are a parent that is all grace with your kids, they're probably entitled little menaces, and the rest of us know it. We just don't know how to tell you yet. But if you're all truth with your kids, well, you're probably way, way too rough on them. And what they're learning from you is, in order to get through life and engage with others, you got to dominate them and argue with them until you win. And they're going to turn out to be little tyrants, or they'll move away and live out every repressed thought and action they ever had all the way through their 20s and 30s. But either way, do you see how one or the other attempts to do right, but generally doesn't result in much good? It actually causes more problems. All grace is intending to do well when it gives their kid dessert every night for dinner. But you're doing harm to that child. But all truth all the time kids, that, you know, in that family, they install the toilet paper upside down and they get an hour-long lecture about responsibility and listening and respect and common sense. Well, that child is also being harmed. And most of us have only seen one of these attributes at a time in a person, or understand these attributes to be opposites. And so we understand God the same way. Which sort of leads us to believe that God has several heads. You know, God's a hydra. He has opposing minds toward us. And so think about how confused we are. That God, as far as many of us have been taught, is simultaneously the God of rigid absolutes, but is also somehow the gracious Son of the merciful loophole. The Trinity then becomes something like good cop, bad cop, neutral cop. Our one eternal God is simultaneously an angry, rigid father who berates us, and then the mom that sneaks into our room afterward to whisper to us, it's just that, you know, Daddy had a rough day at work, and she'll talk to him about, you know, maybe we'll get to go to the movie with our friends. Do you see how it's very problematic? And so the gospel for many Christians is hoping that one part of God will protect us from the other part of God. And I want you to hear me say, this is not good news. This is trauma, and it's got to go. And so to make it worse, what a lot of churches do is they pick one of this hydra's heads, one of God's minds, and they amplify just that part as they understand it. So there are truth churches, or truth denominations. A truth church is like, we have all the mysteries boxed up and explained. All doubt and questioning has been erased. The sermons will tell you exactly what you're supposed to think. Their website, if you peruse their website, it's like, here's exactly what right belief looks like, and it's very detailed. Membership details exactly how you're allowed to act, what you're allowed to do. It's very black and white thinking. All the gray has been erased. And any other churches in the area that disagree, well, they get mocked because they water things down. They're apostate, they're weak, they're liberal, whatever. They don't threaten their congregations properly or frequently enough. And so they'll say things like, just read the Bible and do what it says, or stop resisting the Holy Spirit, or you're not taking God's law seriously, which always means you haven't come to our conclusions, so you're wrong. But this kind of clarity is a real gift for some people, because what it does, it takes all the guesswork and frankly all the thinking out, because somebody else settled it. All the ambiguity and the wonder, all of that's been suspended or erased, and that actually provides some real relief. Like, that's all settled. I can go think about something else now. And maybe it makes sense, and you think that what I'll do now is present grace churches as a contrast, not churches with grace in their name, because plenty of all truth all the time churches have grace in their name. But like, right, so, you know, there's the all truth all the time truth churches, and so what about grace churches? But I think I've come to the conclusion that over the years that those churches don't really exist. And if they do, it's not for very long. Because a church that tries to say we're, you know, all grace all the time is likely to be a community that insists on things like unity, but it refuses to do the work of justice. It refuses to confront toxic behavior or problematic folks, and it just says, well, everybody's a sinner, you know, nobody's perfect, and it sweeps really important things under the rug to keep the peace. It doesn't really deal with reality. It tries to exist by leaving reality outside and creating a subculture, you know, this other thing on Sundays that talks about hope, but there's no action. It's Jesus speaking in detached platitudes, and it really isn't really a church. It's a club for people who, the longer they observe the real world as it actually is, they get more and more fed up and bored with their club. And then the bummer is they'll leave that church and say, I want to go to a church that teaches the truth. And then they get sucked into inhuman rigidity. Or they get turned off by that and they give up on the whole thing. Many of us are carrying this picture, or these pictures of God. And therefore we carry a very exhausting and complicated and problematic picture of what it means to be instructed and deepened and developed as human beings by this God. I mean, listen to people. People say, God is loving, but God is also just, as though they're antagonistic claims. God is gracious, but God is also truth. What do you mean, but? The idea here that God is one, but God must also be the opposite other. Well, it's the opposite other that brings all the pain and the shame and the exclusion. That seems to be the weightier of the two. It's like you're saying, God is a glass of refreshing water, but God is also a glass of poison. Well, only one of those things has me retreating into my animalistic fears and cranking up my ego's desire to stay on the right side and shame other people for being on the wrong side. Those those aren't of the same thing. I've heard at multiple funerals or other pastors at funerals where the deceased wasn't a believer in a way that those who were at the funeral agreed with or understood. And so the people at the funeral would say, well, all we can do now is depend on God's grace. To which we should always respond, well, why can't we count on God's truth? Did it become too late for truth? And weren't we counting on God's grace yesterday and last year when the person was still alive? Like, are we actually saying that all we can do now is hope Dad is in a good mood? That's neither grace or truth. That's an abusive relationship where you never know where you stand and that you and I would never want to be trapped in eternally. I mean, no matter how great the harp music is. And this is why John starts his gospel off this way, framing Jesus in the very early sentences as full of grace and truth and saying, this is what it's like to see the glory of God. It shifts everything. There's just never been anything like this, and John wants you to know it. So now, let's talk about the original Greek words that John uses here. And full disclosure, I don't speak Greek, but I have the internet. And is there really a difference between speaking the infinite nuances of an ancient language and its context and Googling it? Rest assured, I'm not going to dive in past where I can swim, but this is, I think, going to be a very helpful point in what we're talking about here. He says the word, the logos, the wisdom, the cleverness became flesh and set up camp with us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth, full of grace and truth. Pleres caritas kai aleithaias. So pleres is full or filled up, and then kai is and, as in both. So it's full of both. Not 50% of this and 50% of that. It's 100% of both. It's brimming with both, which is amazing and important, and that's why John is putting it this way. John had never encountered somebody full of both before. John's a human being just like you and I, and just like you and I, he knew, like, if you're trying to get a job, you put grace people down in your references, because if you put truth people down, you're not going to get that job. But if you want a precise medical diagnosis, you don't go see a grace person. They're too scared to tell you the truth. They feel too bad. You want a truth person to give you an accurate diagnosis. Everything will go better that way. John knew people were like this, the either or. And he finds it remarkable that Jesus is full of both. He's never seen anyone like this. And this goes beyond simply claiming it in the beginning of your gospel. This is how Jesus is depicted. Like with the rich young ruler, one of my favorite stories, in the Gospel of Mark, we were presented with this young man who's a wealthy Jewish landowner, and he comes to Jesus and he says, "Good teacher, how do I live the life God intended me to live? Because the way I've been doing it has left me a little hollow." And Jesus goes, "Well, follow the commandments." And then he recites several of them to the guy. And the guy goes, No, I've done that. I'm part of the same tradition. I've not gotten it done perfectly, but they've been important to me since a child. I've always taken them seriously. I'm telling you, I still feel empty right now. And Jesus seems to already perceive that this was the case and that this is how the conversation was going to go. So his attitude towards him is like, all right, so you've taken rote recitation of the law and mechanical observation of the rules to their logical end, and you still feel empty. And then Mark adds this note, Jesus had love for the man. And so he tells this young man, okay, now that you can see the problem, liquidate everything, give all of that to the impoverished, and become a full-time student of mine. And we're not told what the guy finally chooses. He goes away sort of panicky because he's actually considering it and considering the ramifications on who he is up to that point. But we have to note that Jesus doesn't shame him. He doesn't say, you're out and this is why you're out. He lovingly helps him see where the problem lies and then invites him in. He doesn't shame, he doesn't condemn, he envelops him in grace, turns the lights on so that the truth can be seen, and then gently waits for that particular formulation to do what it does, which is transforms scared, self-obsessed people into the likeness of Jesus. It's grace and truth. He's full of both. Not antagonistic polarities, but he's brimming with both because they're of the same way of being toward others when you are love. So let's do a word study a little more closely. This other word, charitis. You might, if you listen, you can hear the root word charis, like when somebody has charisma. They're gifted, and that's where we get our word grace. Grace is a gift. Grace is a non-transactional kindness. I do this for you not because I think you'll reciprocate or because you've earned it. I do this based on what's in me, not what's in you. And the idea is that it comes from an eternal place. So it's not rooted in scarcity or limited goods. So that's why it's not a transaction. It doesn't require being replenished. That's grace. This is charis. It's a way of covering, even though nothing's been paid by the other. This is what David is celebrating in the psalm. I thought I owed. No, says the guy with the Sharpie, the accountant with the Sharpie. No, you couldn't pay back anyway. You don't owe anything. This is charis. That's grace. It's non-transactional kindness. It's a gift. But then there's this other word, aleithaias, in which it's really two words glued together. Leithaias means cover or hide, but it has this modifier on the front with the a, which means un or anti. So, you can be moral, but if you have no morals, someone would call you amoral. The a negates or reverses the rest of the word. So leithaias means to cover or veil or hide, but aleithaias means to uncover or unhide, which is to say that the truth in Bible language, it's not an idea you're convinced about or argue about. It's the reality underneath the unreality. It's something that can be revealed. It's not a propositional statement because propositional statements can't set you free. It simply is underneath what isn't. And perhaps you notice the symmetry here. Jesus is full of grace, covers, and truth, uncovers. Jesus is full of covering and uncovering. It's like he's the sunscreen and the sun. He's the anesthesia and the scalpel. He's the dressing and the stripping. And John is amazed by this. Maybe you are. I know that I still am. So then further into our word study here, there's word order. It mattered in ancient Greek like it matters now in English. The first word in a set is given the position of prominence. So notice Jesus is depicted as coming full of grace, then truth. And notice that there is no Bible passage that says Jesus is full of truth and grace. Because if you begin with truth, uncovering and exposing first, even though what you're saying might be right, it's still wrong because it makes the human being secondary to the ideas. It's the wrong priority for Jesus, even if it's the right priority for religion. So, using the power of the cube dissolve transition of PowerPoint circa 2003, let me illustrate this for you this way. Cube dissolve. I have transported myself here to Rose and Lee Collective here in Apex, North Carolina. And you can get here too the traditional way by car or on foot. And I suggest that you women do exactly that, or if you've got women in your life that you care about, that you do come here and or at least check them out online. It's a great story with some great stuff. She'll tell you. I'm here because of this, the changing room. Anywhere that you buy clothes here or somewhere else, you may want to see how you look in those clothes before you commit to it. And so the idea is that you would try it on in a changing room. Because if you strip down and change outside of this room, on this side of the curtain, you might end up not so much in a new outfit as you end up in the evening news. The changing room is the context for stripping and redressing going really well for everybody. You go into this space and you take off what you've got on in order to try out some transformation. And think about it. It's only a thin bit of material, a wall, sometimes it's a door, but it's not much. But it's always enough to take a humiliating and maybe even traumatizing act on this side of the material. It provides safety and security on the inside before being exposed there's a welcome place to do it that protects and encloses and shields. But if we lead with truth, what we're doing often is forcing humiliation. It's that way that is intended to protect ideas or principles over the actual human beings. But leading with grace is how we ensure dignity and kindness, a responsibility for the human being, the human heart. There's still truth, but see, it's encased. Leading with truth is often the way of duty. I have to give my love less to human beings and more to my ideas or our ideas. I have to put energy primarily into structure or a tradition or a model, a pattern, systems, doctrines. I have to defend principles. I have to stand up and defend codes or defend theories or creeds, tenets, formulas, virtues, all that, even if that means real human beings might suffer humiliation, exclusion and isolation, or even violence. And so maybe this helps you see it. Jesus stood up for people while self-protecting truth systems killed him. Jesus, full of grace and truth, was the gentle changing room, facilitating transformation within the enclosure of his care, his consideration, and his vision for who a person actually is. And for this, among other things, he was murdered by people more interested in protecting their systems and their codes and all of that. But they used the same God language, even as they destroyed God-given lives. And perhaps you know someone who has Jesus in their bio, but venom in their posts. Someone who talks Jesus talk, but sounds more like those who killed him than those who were, thrilled to find out that they'd be eating dinner with him that evening. They say the word grace. They even sing Amazing Grace. But they only talk about grace as an afterthought to what really boils down to a harshness. Grace, then truth, generally says we're going to transform at a pace and in a way that blesses rather than curses. And whatever we find in here, I'm with you. You will not be shamed. You will be loved. You can't get me off your team. I will cover you before I uncover you. Why? Because we're never going to get honest if that honesty is going to cost us love and respect and inclusion. I will cover you before I uncover you, because we're never going to get honest otherwise. Do you see how the truth, misordered and misapplied, motivates more lying, more deceit, more pretense, more hiding? We do not become honest until it's demonstrated that that honesty will bless us rather than hurt us further. We cannot be set free by the truth until we see that that truth is going to be rewarded rather than shamed. And listen, I know personally, not because I read it somewhere, this is where my struggle with this exists. I know sometimes it doesn't feel possible to lead with grace, because someone with power will be wielding their power in a way that's crushing someone else. Or sometimes you have to punch up. In the absence of a close relationship, like when a leader says something awful about people that need to be protected, or someone on Facebook says something awful and has Bible quotes for their awfulness, and what they're doing is standing on people that always get walked on for one reason or another, and you just feel like you have to shut it down. Without any sort of tiptoeing or equivocating, you have to come after it. What you actually might be doing is trying to protect others with the changing room of your grace by strongly opposing and pushing back those who, and their alleged dedication to the truth, above all, they actually need to be shut up and shut down until such a time as they can understand the impact on actual human beings their version of the truth and truth sharing has. Sometimes you have to put people in the changing room and punch up at someone else. And Jesus is our model here. His harshest words, his most brutal takedowns were entirely reserved for those powerful leaders whose truths had been weaponized against the disempowered, against those in the margins. Jesus wasn't nice to those kinds of people. He just wasn't. But Jesus' grace, his stunningly inclusive and protective embrace, it always came first for the regular people of his day. And so we emulate this Jesus in our own day-to-day lives. When we say to the people we interact with, your honesty is not going to cost you me. You will be, contrary to the rest of the world and its pageantry, you will be rewarded for the truth. We're going to deal in what's real. You'll be encouraged to be more real, not less. So much so that after a while, you'll grow tired of performing and you'll feel yourself actually coming alive and changing. And the light of the truth that's actually been enveloped and encased in grace. You'll know the truth, and that truth will set you free. I want to thank Rose and Lee Collective. Star transition. Christ teaches us and shows us what God is like. And as he does so, he helps us understand that God doesn't have multiple heads, multiple and opposing personalities. That God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so grace and truth are simply, beautifully, dimensions of the same heart toward us that wants to bless and not crush, wants to awaken and not shame, wants to confront that which is toxic for ourselves and for others. But even within that confrontation, there's always an invitation to participate in healing and renewal. For instance, what else could it love your enemy mean but that God's own self is always inviting perceived opposites to wake up to reality enough to understand that they are one, as God is one. Truth is not a weapon. It's the freedom that comes from dealing with what's real once it's been unhidden. It does, though, become a weapon if there isn't a commitment to keep that truth insulated in grace, to prioritize human beings. And I struggle here. And you can expect to struggle, too, if you're new on the journey. Sometimes I want to go around and bonk people on the heads for being bullies and fools. But that's just me in those moments getting all the beauty of Christ scrambled up inside me until I myself have become a bully and a fool. You could say when I was young, I admired intelligent, right people. But as I get old, I admire more and more kind people. And I think I've been in this protracted season of being stuck between being young and being old. But even in those frequent moments of failing to look just exactly like Christ, I take heart in the changing room curtain is still pulled as far as God is concerned, as far as God's grace is concerned. No amount of failure makes me or you the object of revulsion or shame in the eyes of grace and truth himself. And so that's instructive for how we treat others. The world we find ourselves in today, and you can use the widest lens down to the way that we speak to each other as individuals who could not disagree more than we do. It requires us to understand that it is possible to honor human dignity even as we have to confront grace than truth. That we can thoroughly dismantle falsehood even while being people who exude grace and consideration towards one another. We can take stands while refusing to put our human siblings under our feet as we stand there. And it's not easy, but we can learn it, and we are learning it. We can expose and dismantle and ridicule systems of every size. Systems that attempt to place one human being as more powerful than another, or one power as more noble than another because it was willing to be more brutal, or one voice louder than another because the louder voice is the one that lines the system's pockets to maintain some sort of privilege. We can come after all of that and more while treating the actual individual human beings involved in those systems with grace and the respect and dignity due all human beings because they bear the image of the divine, but also because that's what I would want. It's the golden rule. And it's not easy, but we can learn it. And I think we are learning it. I think we have to. I think we have to. If we want to see the world at every level of human interaction change and heal rather than take on more oppositional energy with itself, then I think it might be worth exploring what it means to fill up with both grace and truth in that order and discover for ourselves whether Jesus' way of resurrecting all things might still work. Grace and peace to all of us. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.